being recorded, and it will be posted to YouTube following the program. And also, if you have any questions or issues with the technology, please feel free to message me in the chat box or send me an email at admin@calmuseums.org, and I will do my best to address your issue. I'm going to pass it over now to the chair of CAM's program committee, Tomoko Kuta, to introduce today's program. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lacey, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been a tremendous series and we've had great conversations, so today is going to be another one. So before we begin, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. As we begin this event, we acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our various regions. A land acknowledgement is a critical step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. We honor and are grateful for the land we occupy and recognize the ongoing damage of settler colonialism. Let's take a moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. I am on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay peoples. I encourage you to name and acknowledge the Native peoples where you are located in the chat box. On behalf of our program committee, I'd like to welcome you all to this ReMuseum program. Recover, reimagine, revive. What does ReMuseum mean to you? Thank you for joining this virtual conversation to delve deeply into the challenges that the museum field is currently facing and how our field can move forward. In this series, members of our program committee are in dialogue with special guests who have knowledge or experience to help us consider new perspectives or explore new directions for our field. Let me remind you that CAM has a board-approved code of conduct for participation in our programs. A link was sent to you in the confirmation for this program, but Lacey is also going to paste the link in the chat box for your convenience. CAM is committed to providing a safe, inclusive, and respectful learning and networking experience for everyone. So Jennifer has mentioned them already, but I'm sorry, Lacey has already mentioned them already, but let me introduce Jennifer and Cody, who will lead today's discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tomoko, and thank you, Lacey. Thanks to all of you for joining us. My name is Cody Lee. I'm the Director of Communications at Laguna Art Museum, and I'm here with Jennifer Caballero, the Director of Marketing at Skirball Cultural Center. As we go along today, I'm going to ask questions for our guest, and Jennifer is going to monitor our chat. So if you have questions as we go, please put your questions in the chat because we'll have time at the end for Q&A, and we'll make sure to get to those. So now to begin, we are really pleased to introduce you to Jen Benoit-Bryan. Jen's the Vice President and Co-Director of Research at Slover Linett, which is a firm that specializes in audience research and evaluation for the arts and culture sector. Jen has overseen more than 60 research and evaluation projects in her years at Slover Linett, and she's the Principal Investigator and Slover Linett Team Director for the Culture and Community in a Time of Crisis study, which is the subject of our session today. Jen, we're so grateful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks so much to Cam and the whole team, Tomoko, Lacey, Jen, Cody, and Joe, our closed captioner, for having me here with you today and for supporting this. I'm really excited about the format of these sessions. I feel like I've done so many PowerPoint presentations, but having more of an informal conversation feels really fresh and new. And I hope that you'll all kind of chime in through the chat with questions as I go through. I'd love for this to be a dialogue across everybody and not just among me, Cody, and Jen.
Thank you so much. So the first question is kind of a big picture one. The Culture Track survey began in the spring and it asked lots and lots of questions about how arts and culture organizations could respond during COVID-19 to help their communities. The year has stretched out before us even longer since then. So it's going to be really interesting to learn about that. To begin, could you give us an overview of the survey? Tell us more about the timing of it, the questions that were asked and participation and that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I will do that. I will try to give the Cliffs Notes version. I love these methodological details, so I'll try not to go too in depth here, but happy to answer any questions that people have about it in more detail. This really started back in March as a conversation between our firm and some other consulting firms, as we were hearing from all of our clients in the arts and culture sector about the kind of uncertainty and real crisis points that they were managing and trying to navigate through. And we saw an opportunity for audience research to help with some of the answers to those many questions that people were grappling with. And so Slover, Linett, the firm where I am, and LaPlaca Cohen, we've had partnerships for lots of clients in the past. LaPlaca Cohen, as many of you know, has run the Culture Track study for almost 20 years now, since just after 9/11 actually was when they first fielded it, and then that moment of crisis. And it felt like an opportunity to create kind of an emergency special crisis edition of Culture Track that would do the same kind of scan of the landscape and try to get this sense of what people need, what they're doing, how cultural organizations can help people and communities during this crisis area. They really wanted a very strong, robust research partner for that. And so together we approached a number of foundations, and we're lucky enough to have some connections to the Wallace Foundation, Sarah and Art Bridges, all of whom came in to help support this work and helped really expedite what we could do. It's also been supported through some for-profit organizations. Focus Vision and Microsoft have both donated their software and support. So it's just been this amazing collection of people who care and want to sort of help. And so it's been pretty incredible to see how all of that working together has actually created one of the largest studies of arts and culture consumers that's ever been conducted at this point. So once we decided, okay, we want to do research, we thought about the fact that we wanted to hear both from people who are already kind of on the lists and in the orbit of arts and culture organizations, but also the general public, because the opportunity for arts and culture organizations to help their communities, we think of as multiple kind of rings of communities around these organizations. We wanted to understand that full landscape. We pulled a huge advisory group together of over 20 people across the sector to really help us think about what questions are most critical to answer and understand, and design these two streams of data, where we worked with NORC, the National Opinion Research Center, to create a very robust, representative sample of the general public, so we could get a sense of what the average American was doing and needing, but also reached out to networks of arts and culture organizations to invite them to send the same survey out to a portion of their lists, so that we could get a sense of those two audiences and how they might converge in terms of what they wanted, but also the points of divergence for them. We thought we might get 40 or 50 organizations that took us up on that offer, and we ended up with more than 650 with people from every state across the country. So the level of interest in knowledge was acute and really critical. And I think the fact that we promised these organizations both a couple of different views, so that they would get access to their own respondents and would be able to see for their organization, what do people need and want and feeling right now, but also have a benchmark against other organizations like them, geographically or sort of focus-wise. So art museums could compare their responses to other art museums, but also orchestras could compare their responses to other orchestra goers. That's just so helpful, I think, to get that benchmarking against other organizations, but also against the general public. And so with that on offer, sort of as the, what we were providing to these participating organizations, interest was quite high. So the survey launched in April. We fielded it for 2 or 3 weeks. It came out. We did some very complicated weighting to sort of combine these two streams of sample into one estimation that's of the US general population, and then have been splitting and analyzing that data really ever since. We ended up with over 120,000 responses from across the country, which gives us a lot more power to really dive into subgroups of this data and analysis that we just can't do with smaller data sets, which has been really exciting. As a very wonky research nerd, it's kind of my dream come true in terms of a data set. Let's see, there have been a few reports. There's a really beautiful, helpful strategy level report that LaPlaca Cohen put out at the overall level. That's at culturetrack.com/COVID study. Maybe I can work with you, Lacey, afterwards to send some of these links to people. But that's publicly available and free to access. Each organization that participated got their own custom kind of tool where they could go and compare their data to others. And then the sort of next and last deliverable that we see coming out of this work is this big report. It's 60 plus pages now that really dives into race and ethnicity across the full Wave 1 data and looking for differences there. And that actually launches next Wednesday, that report. So it's very soon, and I'm going to share a few findings from that report that kind of previewing with all of you today, which will be really exciting. I'm happy to share more about any of those methodological pieces if anyone's curious, but again, I know probably you care more about what we learned than how we got to those answers, so I'm happy to just keep moving.
This is great. This is a huge project, so that's a really great overview for us. I see that Lacey posted in the chat a link. So if you haven't seen it before, please take the opportunity to bookmark that because there's so much to learn. Jen, you said there were 650 organizations from across the country. That's amazing information. That's huge. Since we're the California Association of Museums, though, maybe we'd like to know more about sort of how our own state looks different than the rest of the country. So I wonder if you could tell us maybe some unique to California insights about the data that you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. So prepping for this meeting, when we were doing some conversation about what would be most useful for this group, talking with Cody and Jen, thought about looking at California residents, just sort of the average California resident as kind of one group that might be interesting, but also actually California museum goers and comparing them to sort of museum goers across the country. So we can get a sense of where are California museum goers unique, both from the average California resident, but also from the average museum goer across the country. And so that's kind of where I'm gonna focus in here. But in a few of these places, there's very little for that group compared to some of the others. So I'll still fill in some of the key findings so that you get a sense of that overall picture, but then I'm gonna really emphasize where California museum goers are unique and special here. So I think one of the starting questions here was just what do people need? What do they need more of in their lives during COVID? What are they missing from those in-person arts and culture experiences that they can't be having right now? And what we learned was that in terms of what people are missing or what they need more of, getting outdoors was huge for people. It was big across the country. It was the #1 most missed kind of activity, generally speaking, without that arts and culture lens, but it was even higher actually among California museum goers compared to others. So 64% of California museum goers said that's what I need the most of in my life right now, compared to 59% of California residents more generally, 60% of museum goers across the country. We also see that just connecting with other people and having fun were really important things across the board, kind of no matter your relationship to arts and culture or your geographic location. But among California museum goers, we also saw much higher levels of interest in expressing themselves creatively for people. That was very interesting to me that while it's not one of the most selected options, 27% of California museum goers selected that, compared to 23% of Californians more generally and 22% of museum goers. There's something about California museum goers that's notching that up a little bit more in terms of its importance. In terms of what they miss most from those in-person arts and culture activities, the top choices are fairly universal. Again, it's that spending quality time with family or friends, this desire for connecting with people, which is something that we've lost a lot of in our lives, especially back in like April, May. Really important to people, having fun, relaxing, those are fairly universal. One of the places where California museum goers are a little different though, is in their desire for learning or experiencing something new. That's 44% of people, California museum goers, compared to 40% of museum goers, so fairly common among museum goers, but a little higher among those in California, and 37% of Californians. We look at the general public across the country, it drops down to 32%. So it's a pretty big difference from the average American to the California museum goers on that. While again selected by even fewer people, there is interesting variation here for California museum goers in terms of celebrating cultural heritage too, as something they missed about those in-person arts and culture experiences. That was 10% for California museum goers, and 8% and 7% for museum goers in California. So again, just a little bit higher for California museum goers. The next question was, should arts and culture be playing a role during this pandemic? And if so, what role is that? And we honestly, when we started to put these questions together, we weren't sure if people would just say, look, I need you to kind of pause on the arts and culture while we deal with this health pandemic. But we actually saw that that wasn't the case, that fairly universally, people saw a meaningful role for arts and culture organizations to play during COVID. And it's really emotionally based, that they want help relaxing and laughing and feeling connected to other people. Some more practical needs like educating kids and offering some kind of distraction from the overwhelming messages of COVID and experience of COVID. Nothing particularly unique among California museum goers there, that those kinds of experiences or desires for arts and culture organizations are pretty common across the board. But we also asked about the importance of arts and culture organizations, both before COVID-19 and during COVID-19. And here we see that California museum goers are rated this more highly than both Californians in general, but also museum goers across the country, which I think is interesting. This is a 5-point scale, and so the proportion who selected a 4 or 5 in terms of the importance of arts and culture before COVID among California museum goers was 47%, compared to 37% of the general public. During COVID, it's even higher, 54% among California museum goers versus 40% of the general public. So not only do people see a role for arts and culture organizations to play, they also view them as vital, even more important during a pandemic like this than before that kind of pandemic. One area that we investigated, given that it is a real path towards engagement and connection in this survey, is digital engagement. And I'm just gonna talk about a couple of these points, but I think that's interesting that among California museum goers, awareness of digital offerings around arts and culture is really high, that 84%. I don't think that's too surprising. It is a little higher than sort of museum goers nationally, but just 64% of museum goers in California had actually used an offering from an arts or culture organization up to that point. Now, this survey was fielded in late April and through May. So at this point, the pandemic had only really lasted for like a month or maybe 6 weeks for people. It was fairly new. So we're talking about a pretty short period of time, but 2/3 of people had used some kind of digital activity. And probably not surprising to many of you, very few of them had paid for anything. So the monetization had not yet happened. Just 19% of California museum goers had paid for any content online at that point. One finding that we're really excited about, and we're delving into even more in this race and ethnicity report, is kind of investigating whether or not the people using digital content from organizations, arts and culture organizations, are sort of the usual suspects who were also attending those organizations in person prior to COVID in 2019. And so we were able to kind of triangulate between a couple of different questions to see that the use of digital content from museums by people who hadn't actually been to a museum in a specific category of that type in 2019 is actually quite high for some categories of museums, which I think is exciting because I think it indicates the possibility of broadening audiences in a way that's really interesting. So for art museums of the California, this is California residents in general now, because it wouldn't make sense to focus on California museum goers. Of California residents, 25% of the people using digital content from art museums hadn't been to an art museum in person in 2019, so a fairly big proportion, and it just goes up from there. So it's 28% for botanic gardens, 29% for natural history museums, 37% for zoos and aquariums. And then these last two are kind of crazy. Historic attraction or history museum, it goes up to over half, 53% of people who are using digital content from one of those kinds of sites hadn't been to a site like that in person in 2019, and then 67% of those using content from science or tech museums hadn't been to one in person in 2019. So a pretty wide range in terms of the extent to which that broadening is happening. We do have some hypotheses about that science or tech museum, that it might be connected to kids learning as well, that it may be particularly helpful or more likely to be sort of assigned than some of these other categories of museums, but more to learn there about what's happening. For those last two, the historic attraction or history museum and science or tech museum, California respondents are notably higher in terms of their proportion who hadn't been in person compared to those who had, versus the sort of general public across the country as a whole. And then people are getting really important things out of those online. Oh, sorry, did you have a question, Cody?
No, please go ahead. Thanks, though.
Yeah. In terms of what they're getting out of those online activities. So the sort of top things are fairly aligned with what people were missing from the in-person activities. They're being fun. They're getting that kind of relaxation that they were really missing. If you'll recall, in terms of what people miss from in-person, connecting with family or friends was at the top of the list, and that is not something that most people were getting, at least at that point, out of these online activities. And so I think there's maybe opportunity there. I know it's difficult to foster those kinds of connections in an online environment, but people are really hungry for them and currently aren't getting them. I will say too that feeling creative or creatively inspired is much higher among California museum goers at 39%, saying that they got that out of one of their digital activities, compared to just 29% across museum goers around the country and 36% of Californians. So interesting that sense of feeling creative or creatively inspired is something that California museum goers wanted more of and are more likely to be getting out of the activities that they're choosing to do. They may be seeking out those kinds of activities. And then the last section here about this California lens is really just looking to the future. We asked a few questions about the kinds of change that people might want to see in arts and culture organizations going forward. And there are some very interesting differences here among California museum goers, that the most desired type of change was supporting local artists and organizers, with 31% of California museum goers. That's a little lower among Californians in general at 25%, 28% of museum goers across the country. So not too far off, but the second most desired kind of change in arts and culture organizations was to be seeing and hearing from more diverse voices and faces. And that was selected by 29% of California museum goers, but just 18% of the general public, and 21% of all museum goers across the country. And so that really does feel more unique to California. I think the diversity of the state population in California is probably helping to drive that to some extent, but it feels important. And then we also see that there's that sense of wanting more diversity may also be reflected in the fact that people are also wanting stories and content that feels more relevant to their lives. So I do think that there could be some connection between those two. We have some more to kind of investigate there. But those are the key areas of difference. I would say that across that whole picture, the places where I feel like California museum goers really stand out the most are in this desire for creative expression, which is interesting. We see that in a number of places across the survey, but also this sense of wanting greater diversity, stories that reflect their lives, and then that sort of missing celebrations of cultural heritage. All of those, I think, could kind of roll up to a broader theme. Okay,
that's great. Jen, you saw my excitement. You saw my excitement when you were talking about people using digital content. And I think that the people on this call who work on all that digital content so much this year, especially, are probably really glad to hear that as well. People who are using the digital content, maybe not yet being frequent visitors to museums. So those make me sort of think about the diversity of our state. We all know that California is the most populated state. It's really diverse by every measure. And for a lot of reasons, that's become, an increasingly important topic for museums to think about in terms of our staff, our audiences, what we represent and who we serve. So I wonder if you have data that sort of gives you a lens on responses across race and ethnicity in California, or in the survey in a larger way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mentioned that we have this report will be coming out next week that gives a lot more detail on this, but I have pulled out a few of the highlights to kind of share with you the things that feel most important. I will sort of say that this is at the national level, so we're kind of zooming up from that California focus to a broader national focus here. But some of the same themes I think are helpful to touch on. So circling back to sort of what people missed about in-person arts and culture engagement, a lot of those elements are really similar across racial and ethnic groups, kind of that desire for social connection and fun, but there are some really interesting differences here too, that Black or African Americans are much more likely to miss how cultural activities help them feel relaxed and reduce stress, 48% of them versus 39% overall. And then much higher proportion of Native Americans who share that they miss that celebration of cultural heritage that they got through in-person activities, 37% of them versus 6% of the population as a whole. So some places where the, what people were getting out of arts and culture activities and what they miss is really being shaped a little bit or influenced by race and ethnicity. And we see this as well with respect to creative activities. This is really striking around Hispanic or Latinx Americans, that they're participating in a whole range of creative activities like painting, drawing and sculpting, dancing, photography, filmmaking, at higher rates than other racial and ethnic groups during COVID-19. And sometimes those gaps are actually Hispanic or Latinx Americans are participating in these activities at sometimes double or even triple the rate of other racial and ethnic groups. So really interesting trend to follow there. That might actually hook into that trend we talked about for Californians, just knowing that the proportion of Hispanic or Latinx Americans in California is higher than in many other parts of the country. That may be connected here. And then with digital engagement, we talked a little bit about how among digital users, there's these two groups, those who had been in person in 2019 or kind of recent attenders, and those who had not. And we wanted to take that one step further and really compare those two groups and get a sense of whether or not there were any differences with respect to race and ethnicity, education, income between those two groups that might indicate that there's both a broadening as well as a diversification of audiences happening through this digital platform. And we're seeing some really interesting evidence of that. We're sort of terming these people who hadn't been in 2019, but were using content through organizations as digital only, even though they may have attended at some point just prior to 2019. But those users have a much higher proportion of Black or African Americans compared to the digital users who'd also been in person among a bunch of different genres. So we see that across all of the performing arts genres that we measured, classical music, jazz, theater, dance, but also some collecting institutions, including botanical gardens, natural history museums, and art museums, that those people who hadn't been in person were much more likely to be African American or Black than those who had been, who were using digital content. We see that as well for Hispanic or Latinx. For them, it's mostly with science or tech museums, actually, and libraries, where we see diversification along those dimensions. It's fairly universal with respect to education levels. Really across the board, we see on almost every genre that there are much higher proportions of people with high school education or less who are using digital content through organizations that they hadn't been to in person compared to those who had been in person, and also some income effects. So some really interesting and promising, I think, findings with respect to the ways that digital content and engagement may be reducing barriers to participation in ways that I think some of which we know or have hypothesized, that geography and actually physically getting to a location can be a barrier. Whether or not you see people like you in the audience can be a barrier. Zani Voss at SMU Data Arts has some really interesting upcoming research about that among the performing arts. That sometimes the architecture of the buildings themselves can be fairly imposing and really have this kind of threshold barrier that it can be hard for people to cross, even if there's really engaging and relevant content within an institution. So lots of ways that digital engagement may be reducing barriers we want to explore in further detail. There's a lot more information on this in the report with lots of graphics and numbers attached. I'm just kind of giving you the broad strokes here, but I think this is probably the most interesting and exciting finding that's emerged from our research so far. And then finally, organizational change. This may not be too surprising, but when we asked people about the different kinds of ways that organizations could potentially change, almost 3/4, 72% of them picked at least one of those ways that they would like to see organizations change, rather than the option that said, like, nope, I'd like it to stay the way that it is. That desire for change among arts and culture organization is really felt more acutely by BIPOC communities than it is among white or Caucasian communities. So 76% to 89%, depending on which community we're focused on, of BIPOC communities found some kind of change that they wanted to see. And that was much lower for white or Caucasian Americans. So there's that desire for change, or the vision of, how organizations could change really varies by race and ethnicity. And the kind of change that people want to see, there's also some variation there, that really the desire for organizations to become more inclusive, to have that broader diversity of voices and faces, to be more centered around people and sort of focused on local artists, organizations, helping young people in your community, that all of those were much higher among most BIPOC communities than among the general public as a whole. So one of the other kinds of change that we looked at is also interesting. I think that one is really focused on becoming more fun, less formal, and more child-friendly. And that was particularly likely to be appealing to Hispanic or Latinx Americans, who also are more likely to have younger kids at home, which makes sense. And we did look across like 15 different response options and looked to see the sort of patterns that people used to group and select those responses. And that's what really informed these kind of broader categories that we've put together around types of things that people want to see. So more on that in the report as well. I've gone through a lot of findings, I feel like, and I'm happy to talk about any of them in more detail, but I kind of want to pause and just give you a sense of kind of what's coming up next, and then see if anybody has questions. Does that sound okay?
This is great. Yeah, I think as you were speaking, I just thought that we all work so much on our content, and we also do practical things to try to reduce barriers. And it sounds like, even though this has been a challenging year, I look for silver linings, and one could be that we're finding ways to reduce barriers through digital engagement, maybe. But I think you're already leading to this, and that makes me think that, of course, from this data, we hope to find things that are actionable. We hope to find things that people respond to, that people value, and that we can use to improve what we offer people. So maybe that leads us to talk more about that.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And I feel like one of the questions that we get a lot of right now is, how important is it for us to continue to invest in digital after COVID, whenever after COVID actually arrives, or whatever that looks like. And I feel like many people have conceptualized, not every organization, but many are conceptualizing digital engagement as the sort of pathway towards in-person engagement, right? Like, it's only effective or useful or valid if it leads to an in-person visit. But I feel like this research in some ways is being leveraged in some organizations right now to make a case for a digital engagement being just as valid as an in-person engagement, and not necessarily having to lead to that in-person moment, that it could in and of itself be valuable and useful and relevant. And I think that there is a case being made in some organizations that I know of, where we're sort of consulting, to put more funding in the longer term perspective towards digital engagement going forward. Because so much has really been diverted into it during this time of crisis when our doors are closed. But when they reopen, I think there's going to be some hard choices to make about how to handle those funds going forward. It's a really interesting question, Cody. Yeah, I totally agree, and would love insights from anybody on the call about how you're thinking about digital engagement going forward. So we, as always, I think good research raises more questions than it answers. And so we have some qualitative work that's planned. There were a number of places in the study. I've highlighted a few of them, but there are lots more where there are really interesting differences among Black or African Americans in particular. And so we were quite interested in really following up on that. And so we have 50 interviews with Black or African Americans coming up to dive into some of the questions where we found a difference, but we don't understand why that difference is there. And we have a really great research team that we've put together to investigate those questions with us. And those interviews will be starting in January, so we're excited to do that. Those interviews will also help us think about kinds of arts and culture activities that we ask about, because one of the things that we found was we had this huge list of like 35 different activities, many of which had been on prior culture track studies, but we also added to it to try to make it as broad and inclusive as possible. It includes like video games and TV programs and all kinds of things. And for most racial and ethnic groups, we saw what activities people selected may vary by race and ethnicity, but the likelihood that somebody found themselves somewhere on that list was very high. Black or African Americans are an exception to that they were less likely to select something from that list. And so we feel like we may have missed something important about arts and culture that is part of the lives of Black or African Americans. So that's one of the reasons we really want to understand, what does culture look like to them? What are they participating in? Make sure that that definition is broader so that everyone can find themselves somewhere. But what we're analyzing is what are the differences in terms of where people find themselves. So anyway, lots of findings kind of converging on this. So that qualitative work is coming up soon, and then we'll actually be doing a second wave of the quantitative survey in spring of 2021, which we're starting to plan for now, putting together an advisor group. We'll be inviting all 650 organizations that participated in wave 1 back if they're interested in participating again, and then broadening the sample in a few really sort of purposeful ways going forward, pulling libraries in a pretty big way this time. They were not included as part of the sample last time. But also really trying to oversample among culturally specific organizations or really community embedded arts and culture organizations who were underrepresented in the first wave of the survey. So that's our plan.
I'm going to jump in here and say that, Jen, I just, as somebody who, has sort of long wished for the ability to have this kind of information and this robust data. It's just a treat to hear from you and your thoughts and just have this unique California lens on a lot of the data. I'm excited for that. I do want to kind of ask a little bit about your point about, certain groups found museum digital experiences better for relaxing, and certain groups found it better for just inspiring their own creativity. And some of those questions, I kind of don't feel like I remember seeing those specific results in my institution's response. Mm-hmm. So I kind of would encourage everybody on this call who was part of the study to, and I see that there's some comment in the chat that there has been, some institutions have looked back on the data that they got and they're going to share it with their team. We're going to do that at the Skirball next week. I think it's not too late if you haven't. I mean, I will say on the timing of this study was kind of, April, May, and then June and summer. And so maybe some folks haven't had the chance to drill into it. But I think just listening to you today, it's certainly not too late to get some really interesting material from it. And Cody, I think you mentioned that your institution had gone through it fairly early on, but I think today is a reminder that this is available to all of us. So thank you for being so great and sharing this. I do want to go over to some of the chat questions. Lou Spriggs from the Huntington said that they participated in it and the search results demonstrated social connection matters. Kind of, it was the big takeaway, and that's clearly what you're saying at the outset of this. There are a lot of marketers on this call, and there are a lot of people who don't do marketing on this call. The title of this session is Marketing Now, and I think that the research that you're sharing with us is important in kind of our marketing of our institutions going forward, or just right now. Talk about how we may, kind of look at this data that you're sharing broadly. We could look at our own institutions' data that we got if we were participating, and kind of the marketing lens. Like I did ask you about that, like, well, some groups like to use their arts organization experiences for relaxing, but others like to do it to inspire their own. So that's kind of two messages, or maybe we should do some segmented marketing of the things that we're offering at our institutions. Can you speak to that? As a professional researcher, I'm sure you're gonna, like, how do we even measure that at our institution? Like, really, if we want to reach out to a specific audience, are there minimum sort of levels of audience feedback that we should be paying attention to do something actionable?
Yeah, I do think that finding, which really crosses a lot of the questions in the survey around how critically people miss feeling connected to other people, is a really interesting one, both from a like program planning perspective, but also from a marketing perspective. And I know that some organizations have started to experiment with program design to try to keep this in mind. One of the things that we've learned through other research is that the places where people tend to feel the greatest kind of connection, especially outside of their groups, are when they have repeat connections in small enough groups that they feel like they get to know people. And so that's an area where I know Caroline Gaser, who's the programming director at the Museum of Fine Art in Houston, is doing some really interesting experimentation with these small kind of book clubs that are focused around an exhibition theme, but that meet like for 8 weeks, once a week, so that you actually start to see the same people, recognize faces, build on conversations and connections that you've had previously, which I think is really that key to feeling connected to people. Any kind of interactive element, I mean, we do these breakout groups sometimes, you can talk in those small groups and make more of a personal connection with people, I think really helps. But I guess I think it's really open to a lot of experimentation, but I think keeping those principles in mind with respect to program development about how do you create opportunities for people to re-engage and to, you know, connect meaningfully around something that ties them together is really exciting and is really interesting to explore. From the marketing front, I think, you know, the challenge is often shifting people's views, right? If they don't think of a museum as a place where they can connect with new people, then it can be really hard to kind of change their perspective on that or change their view on that. And so I think that it's a harder barrier when you're sort of shifting away from a previously held belief. And I don't know that, we don't have evidence in the survey that people don't see museums that way, but I do think that generally speaking, they tend to seek out those kinds of institutions for connection with other people in their party. And so I do think that there are potentially ways to support that as well. I mean, Netflix is a very big kind of example, but they've been doing these like watch parties where you can watch the same show with people in your family unit and comment together. So, you know, just figuring out, like, are there ways to continue to be that platform for experiences that people want to have together and for that bonding, but in the digital realm. So just a very small sort of order request for
That's
all
all.
these institutions out there. You know, for marketing, it's mostly about demonstrating and really messaging around that. This is a place you can connect. Here are the ways that you can do that.
Terrific. Okay, we did have another question. There is a question in the study. How would you ideally want arts and culture?
Kind of a feature you're not going to have. This is
Somehow. For the question, how would you want to ideally have arts and culture organizations help your community during the crisis in the study? Can you clarify what's meant by the option look ahead and plan for recovery? Do audiences want arts and culture organizations to look ahead and plan internally to recover and reopen to the public is the question?
Yeah, that's certainly what, yeah, it's such a good question, Gail. Thank you for asking it. It's certainly what we had in mind when we put that question together. We did do some cognitive testing of this instrument with people to try to make sure that the way that we were thinking about these question wordings would be similar to how they're interpreted. And so this is one that we tested in that way, and it was how most people were interpreting it. That said, we didn't actually define it, and it could be kind of open to interpretation. So I want to say yes with a little bit of a grain of salt, that there may be some people who were thinking of it a little bit more broadly or differently, but generally speaking, yes, that's what we had in mind.
Great.
I think that's such a good question. I feel like a lot of us have been in a mode for 9 months where we're trying to be responsive and fast, and that makes it kind of hard to plan for the future. So that kind of framework helps us think about that, you know, it won't always be like today, and we still have to keep working on what we're doing in the future as we go.
Mm-hmm.
Karen Kinzel also asked a question. Karen, I don't know if you want to interact directly with us, but it's kind of working with adults and parents, kind of young children. They're zoomed out, not interested in virtual programs is kind of an observation.
Mm-hmm.
Karen, did you want to ask anything or do you want me to?
Sure. I know I'm really interested in this kind of virtual engagement by age, because what we're seeing is that it is our older donors and members who are responding most positively to virtual programs, whereas parents who are doing virtual education with their kids at home want their kids to be engaged in hands-on in-person activities. Similarly, working professionals who are spending their entire day on Zoom also want to engage in a kind of hands-on in-person context. I mean, here in Northern California, we've had the opportunity to actually offer outdoor in-person activities. Right now, of course, we're sheltering in place and don't have that opportunity, but I'm wondering if the data looked at virtual engagement, interest in virtual engagement by age group.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thanks, Karen. I have run out the sort of age bands by generation and have done some looking at that, but I don't remember off the top of my head what the differences were in digital engagement. So I'm going to look at that and email you. If you will just shoot me over your email, that would be amazing. What I can say is that part of the value of this research is that it came fairly quickly after the beginning of this crisis, but we're really don't know how things have changed, because I totally feel that Zoom fatigue, and I see it in the way that I interact with arts and culture digital content, and I expect that we would see some different responses now compared to what we saw back in sort of April. So that's something that we're really interested in understanding next spring, is kind of where are people with their desire, with their past history with respect to digital engagement, but also with what they want to do going forward. I do think that you may be seeing also this influx. We saw that among California museum goers, that desire to be outside was really high in terms of what they wanted more of in their lives. So I wonder if this outdoor programming might be kind of overlapping with that level of interest in that outdoor programming. I really wish we could do more of that in Chicago, but you're not even doing it right now in California. So yeah, it's such a good question. So more soon, and I'm happy to share those. If anybody else is interested in that, I'm happy to share it with them. Just shoot me your email.
Thank you for that, Jen, and good question, Karen. I feel like another key point that you brought up was, this was early in the pandemic and people hadn't been paying for any programs, and we have had some time and people are sort of figuring out where there might be a paywall or there might be a member exclusive type program. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like the spring 2021 survey tool will include, paid programming or ways that people can, be creative and still, bring in a few dollars, or think about their member exclusives or something like that for arts and culture?
Yeah, I think it's really critical, especially given the ways that we've seen that all of the free content that got released early on seemed to potentially help with this kind of broadening and diversification of audiences. We're really curious about whether or not increased paywalls, as organizations are looking to fund their continued operations in a totally legitimate way, whether or not that has impacts on the sort of diversification of audiences that we're seeing, especially knowing that income was one of the big areas where we were seeing much greater accessing of digital content through organizations among those with the lowest incomes. So that's something that I know a lot of organizations are grappling with and trying to understand, what are the monetary benefits of kind of monetizing digital content? Like, how much of a revenue stream could we get feasibly? But also, what's the offset in the kind of engagement and broadening and diversification of the audiences engaging with us? How much of our mission is about that broadening and diversification of audiences we could be accomplishing through low paywall kinds of digital engagement? So we're really interested in kind of exploring the nuances of that question in more detail in the spring.
Well, I don't think that anybody is really waiting for, us to kind of go back to the way it was before, but we're just trying to kind of figure out now that we're in this new hybrid model of digital and in-person, and I don't think that there's too many museums out there who are going to just, close their doors and go completely digital. But mm-hmm. We have to transform to kind of prioritize the digital as well as the in-person. It can't be kind of, you know, like you say, just a path to the what I'm using, the threshold, like that threshold fear kind of thing that I have heard at many conferences. But I do want to kind of encourage anybody, if there's any further questions, to put them in the chat. If there are thoughts that you want to ask Jen, who is a world-class researcher, about what she envisions for the year to come, I think it would be great to hear from anybody out in the audience now. Cody, did you have a question too? I thought I saw you raise your hand. No?
I had a really strange question, and I hope it's not too much of a curveball, but it occurred to me that even though we have this huge number of responses, I think you said 120,000, those all were people who came from the cultural organization's email lists, right? So I wonder if there's any thought to sort of how those people might already be sort of self-selected, culturally engaged people versus the Americans who are not on any organization's list in the first place.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's so critical to the methodology of this study. So most of the responses that came in did come in through the list of arts and culture organizations, but we did do this kind of random sample representative panel, and worked with the incredibly high quality, but also very expensive NORC out of University of Chicago to do that. They're the ones that do the American Community Survey on behalf of the census every year. So it's just really incredible statisticians there. And what they helped us do was use that kind of random probability sample of the general public, of the average American, to create kind of a framework that we could then kind of downweight all of this we call it sort of an oversample, right? We heard from way more people on arts and culture lists than we really needed to for a representative sample. We downweighted all those voices and upweighted the panel voices so that the total combined sample is within like 2 percentage points from the representative general public sample. And that's a pretty cutting edge kind of statistical weighting technique. We're actually going to present at the DSM, the big gathering of statisticians on that method soon. It's really exciting that we were able to take advantage of the expertise there, because it goes much further than my own training in survey methodology and design. But it really enables us to do these kinds of in-depth cuts where we're just focusing on the people who use digital content. And then we're dividing that even further into those who had been before versus those who had not. And then we're dividing that even further into those in the art museum world who use digital content from art museums. And so having this huge oversample, even though we downweight it when we're trying to look at the overall population, means that we can get much richer and more in-depth kind of cuts of the data, which is really exciting. But it's such a good question, Cody, and I'm so glad you asked it, because it's complicated, and I try not to get too far into the weeds on it, but the way that all the sort of processes we went through for the weighting will allow us to have a really good approximation of the US general public.
That's really helpful. I know we have to, as marketers especially, be targeted in the work that we do, but at the same time, our museums do want all the audiences all the time. So it's good to think of it in both ways. And maybe it's a good note for like novice data people like me to remember that the more data you have, the larger your sample size, the larger the collection you're doing, the better, not only the better results or more insightful results, but sort of the more ways you can sort of shift that and look at it in different ways.
Yeah, you have a lot more power in your statistical analysis, which is great. I will say too that we're seeking input right now on the kinds of questions that we ask in the spring of 2021. So we're actually going to be sending a survey out to all the organizations that participated in the first wave to get a sense of both kind of where we could improve our own communication process to make things run a little bit more smoothly, but also to understand what is most pressing for you to understand about your audiences and about how your audiences might compare to other audiences. So please look out for that. Those of you who did participate last time, we'd really love your input and your feedback on that. We want this to be useful and actionable for you. And so that's, we need you. We need you for that, 100%.
Well, we are at about 12:57, so I don't know that we have too much time for further questions, but I I see that some folks are looking, Celine, that looks like you have a TikTok dance challenge to share. So that's cool. I am happy to share emails from anybody who's on this call if you have some further questions later. Like I said, you know, looking forward to maybe doing this type of a conversation after we have the second wave or after we hear from your study that comes out on Wednesday. There could be another conversation that we have. There's going to be, you know, the CAM virtual summits are coming up in the spring. And so maybe there's an opportunity for some of that data to fold into some of the presentations there. So I'm very excited about continuing this conversation and keeping research in part of all of our marketing jobs and getting the word out about our important institutions. So, so Cody, did you have any other last comments or questions for Jen?
I don't have any more, just to say thank you. This was really an amazing presentation about something that we've all been very interested in. And I feel like you've really opened our eyes and given us a lot of good tools. So we really, really appreciate your time and your insights. This is really great for all of us.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's great. And thanks to all the organizations that participated. I mean, we would never have had such a rich data set if this hadn't been picked up by so many. So see that many of the people on this call participated and really appreciate that support. So
that's really great.
Please don't hesitate to reach out if any other questions come up. I'm going to stick my email in the chat. I should have done that earlier. Or maybe, Lacey, can you share it when you email out? That might be better.
Yeah. So Jen, Jennifer, and Cody, thank you so much for today's discussion. You know, really jump-started a lot of good thinking. And yeah, I think there will be a lot of follow-ups for all of the organizations. And just a reminder to all the participants, you'll be getting a program evaluation, I think along with Jen's contact information. So please look out for that email. And then next week, we have our very last ReMuseum program. So on behalf of the program committee of CAM and the board of directors, I want to invite everybody back to a session that's going to be called Moving Forward. And it's going to be very exciting. It's not going to recap everything, but it's really, you know, taking all the great things that have been shared throughout all these many weeks at the ReMuseum series and sharing one last time. And then we did, I think Jennifer mentioned that we have a spring virtual summit series coming your way. So please take a look at CAM's website as we update information and set our dates. They're not there yet, but the idea is percolating and great proposals are being reviewed right now. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.